Yakutia, Siberia, September 1894. While every wealthy settler in a remote outpost of Yakuts rushed to install polished timber floorboards as a sign of Russian aristocracy and civilization, Dmitry Volkov was on his hands and knees, mixing freezing river mud with reindeer blood. The 33-year-old exile, who had spent his youth in the peasant villages of the Ural Mountains, had spent 2 weeks hauling dense clay from the banks of the Lena River. He mixed it into a thick, visceral paste and spread it across his cabin floor in 6-inch layers. "He lives like a wild animal," whispered the wife of his nearest neighbor, "too poor for proper timber floors." But Dmitry wasn't poor. He had piles of seasoned larch logs stacked behind his shelter. And if you want to find out why he chose dirt over wood when the worst winter in Yakutian history arrived, listen closely. Dmitry had arrived in Yakutia in the spring of 1891, when 1,000 seeking fortune or fleeing the Tsar's reach. He carried memories of the stone izbas, huts, where his grandmother had lived in '93 without ever feeling truly cold. Those cottages had earthen floors, packed clay, worn smooth by generations of boots, warmed by massive brick stoves that burned low and slow. Dmitry had slept on those floors as a child, curled near the fire on winter nights, feeling the heat rise from the earth itself as the flames died down. The floor held warmth the way a mother holds a child, gently, persistently, through the darkest hours. But the new settlement was different. The merchants and settlers he met spoke of wooden floors as markers of progress. Dirt floors meant poverty, ignorance, and a failure to advance beyond primitive conditions. The first thing a successful settler did was mill lumber and lay boards, lifting his family above the earth like civilized people. Dmitry's first Siberian winter taught him what that civilization cost. He had built a standard cabin in 1891, with a timber frame and a wooden floor raised 18 inches above the ground to avoid the shifting permafrost. The difference was immediate and brutal. His new cabin, despite being better constructed in every visible way, consumed twice the firewood of the old peasant huts. Heat that had once accumulated in the earth now vanished through the floorboards into the sub-zero air beneath. He woke at 2 a.m., at 4 a.m., and at 5 a.m. to feed a fire that seemed to devour wood without ever truly warming the space. By February, he was burning furniture. By March, he was hauling deadfall from miles away because he'd exhausted every tree within walking distance. His neighbors suffered the same fate, but blamed the winter rather than their floors. "This is Yakutia," they said. "The cold here is a demon. You just have to burn more wood." They accepted the equation as fixed. More cold meant more fuel, and prosperity meant spending that fuel on proper wooden floors that separated civilized men from the dirt. Dmitry wasn't convinced. He remembered the warmth that rose from the clay floor hours after the fire had become embers. The peasants hadn't been primitive. They had been efficient. They understood something about heat and earth that modern progress had forgotten. In 1894, he bought a better plot of land near the forest edge and prepared to build again. He had money now. He could afford milled lumber, glass windows, and a proper iron stove. His neighbors expected him to build the finest house in the settlement. Instead, he started hauling clay from the riverbank in his wagon, load after load of dense red earth. When asked what it was for, he simply said floors, and offered no further explanation. The whispers began before he'd laid a single log. The exile had lost his mind, they said. 3 good years, and he still wanted to live like a peasant. His wife, Katya, must be ashamed. But Dmitry kept hauling clay. The first direct confrontation came from his nearest neighbor, a wealthy fur trader named Boris Ivanov, who had settled the adjacent plot. Boris had built what he considered the model Siberian home. Plank floors, plaster walls, and glass windows shipped from Irkutsk at considerable expense. He viewed himself as a civilizing force on the frontier and took personal offense at Dmitry's clay pile. "Volkov, I need to speak plainly," Boris said, riding up to where Dmitry was unloading another wagon of riverbank clay. "What you're planning is an embarrassment to this community." Dmitry set down his shovel. "And what am I planning, Boris? Dirt floors like a savage, like you just crawled out of a cave. You have money. You have lumber. There's no excuse for this except stubbornness or stupidity. And I've never taken you for stupid. My grandmother lived 83 years on a dirt floor. Dmitri replied calmly. She never once woke up cold in the night. Your grandmother lived in the Urals. This is Yakutia. The cold here will kill you if you don't build properly. Boris leaned forward in his saddle. I'm telling you this as a friend. The other families are talking. They're saying you're not fit to be part of this community if you can't maintain basic standards. Dmitri nodded slowly. I appreciate the warning. So, you'll build the proper floor. I'll build the floor my grandmother would have recognized. You're welcome to visit in January and tell me I was wrong. Boris rode away, shaking his head. By evening, word had spread to every homestead within 5 miles. The social consequences were immediate. At Sunday services in the small wooden church, families who'd previously been friendly kept their distance. Boris's wife, Maria, pulled Dmitri's wife, Katya, aside. My dear, you don't have to live this way, Maria said, her voice dripping with sympathy. If your husband won't provide a proper home, the community can help. Katya, who remembered the same warm cottage floors of her childhood, smiled politely. We are not in difficult circumstances, Maria, but thank you for your Christian concern. The assumption of poverty stung more than the assumption of ignorance. Dmitri could have built the grandest house in the district. Instead, he was choosing clay over lumber, earth over wood, tradition over progress. What Dmitri understood intuitively, and what modern building science would later quantify, was the physics of thermal mass. What insulates, it resists heat transfer, keeping warm air separated from cold air. This sounds beneficial until you realize that insulation works in both directions. A wooden floor raised above the ground creates an air gap that prevents cold from entering, but it also prevents heat from being stored. The floor itself holds almost no thermal energy. The moment a fire dies, the air begins cooling immediately with nothing to slow the decline. Clay operates on entirely different physics. Dense, heavy, and moisture-resistant. When properly prepared, clay doesn't insulate, it absorbs. A cubic foot of packed clay can hold a massive amount of thermal energy. Dmitri's planned floor, 6 inches deep across his cabin, would act as a thermal battery. Heat the floor to 80 degrees Fahrenheit during a day of fire, and you've stored enough energy to radiate warmth for 12 to 16 hours. As the mass slowly releases its captured heat back into the room, the floor discharges energy through the cold night. The reindeer blood wasn't primitive superstition. It was chemistry. Blood contains albumin proteins that, when mixed with clay and allowed to dry, create molecular bonds that harden the surface and make it resistant to moisture and wear. The practice dated back thousands of years. Dmitri had watched his grandmother's floor being relayed once in his childhood. It involved slaughtering an old cow and mixing its blood with clay. That floor had lasted another 40 years. There was one more advantage. Heat rises. In a cabin with a wooden floor, warm air accumulates at the ceiling while cold air settles at the floor. Families sit with their heads warm and their feet freezing. An earthen floor reverses this. The floor absorbs heat during the day and radiates it upward. The temperature distribution becomes uniform. A room that feels warm at foot level requires less overall heating than a room that's only warm at head height. The floor preparation began in late August. Dmitri needed the clay to cure before the freeze. He selected a deposit along the Lena River, where the bank exposed dense red earth. 14 wagon trips over 3 weeks. The reindeer blood came from a herd he had culled for winter meat. He mixed it in a shallow pit, clay, blood, and water, roughly 1 part blood to 8 parts clay. He worked the material with a hoe for hours. The first layer went down 2 inches thick, spread by hand. Dmitri worked barefoot, feeling for inconsistencies. This base layer dried for 5 days. Then the next, 3 layers total. Between layers, Dmitri burnished the surface with smooth river stones, compressing clay and sealing the pores. The blood proteins darkened as they dried, turning the floor from red-brown to deep mahogany. Katya helped with the final layer, polishing the curing clay with linseed oil. By early October, the floor was complete. It gleamed in the autumn sunlight, smooth and solid as fired pottery. Dmitri pressed his palm against the surface and felt the density, the mass, the potential energy waiting to be awakened. Boris Ivanov rode by and peered through the open door. He said nothing, but his expression spoke clearly. The exile has built a hovel with a mud floor. Dmitri smiled and began stacking firewood, significantly less than his neighbors. By November, the story grew. The man who mixed blood with mud. Harold Whitmore, no, Boris Ivanov, organized a welfare visit in mid-November with 3 other men. They found Dmitri splitting wood. "We're concerned for your wife," Boris announced. "Living on dirt floors is not suitable." "Come inside," Dmitri said. The men entered and stopped, confused. The floor gleamed like dark leather. It was smooth, seamless, without a single crack. It felt solid under their boots, not like dirt at all. "It doesn't feel like earth," admitted Alexei Petrov, a neighbor. "It's clay," Dmitri said, "cured with blood. It holds heat." Boris scoffed. "Holds heat? Nonsense. Everyone knows dirt is cold. Come back in January, Volkov, then we will see." The winter of 1894 to 95 announced itself on December 6 with a blizzard that buried fences. Temperatures plunged to minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. It was one of the worst winters in memory. Boris Ivanov's cabin, with its proud plank floors, became a furnace of desperation. He burned through half a cord of wood in 4 days. His wife slept in wool stockings and a fur hat. The wooden floor was the problem, raised above frozen ground. The plank sat atop a pocket of air that had dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold radiated upward. His children's feet turned red and painful. Alexei Petrov fared worse. His floor planks warped, letting wind seep through. By Christmas, he was burning his dining chairs. 3 settlers died that December, found frozen in their beds when their fires died out at the Volkov homestead. December passed with comfort. Dmitri built his fire in the morning, burning hard for 3 hours until the stove glowed. Then he let the flames die. The floor did the rest. Clay that had absorbed heat all morning released it slowly. Katya walked barefoot across the surface. Their children played on a floor that maintained 60 degrees Fahrenheit through the coldest nights. They burned 4 logs a day. Their neighbors burned 20 on Christmas Eve. The temperature dropped to minus 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Dmitri checked the stove at 10 p.m., added a single log, and went to bed. He woke at 6 a.m. to a cabin that was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Chilly but safe. At Boris's cabin, Boris woke every 2 hours to feed a fire that couldn't keep up. By dawn, his interior was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. His wife was weeping from exhaustion on December 28th. Alexei Petrov appeared at Dmitri's door, half frozen. "Can my family shelter here?" "Bring them," Dmitri said. Alexei stared at the warm cabin, at Katya walking barefoot. "How?" he whispered. "It's like a heated stone," Dmitri explained. "That's all it is." Alexei's family arrived. 7 people in the cabin. The extra bodies actually helped, adding body heat that the floor absorbed and redistributed. Dmitri borrowed a thermometer and took readings. Floor level, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Head height, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. A difference of only 5 degrees. He measured Alexei's cabin later. Floor level, 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Head height, 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A 25-degree difference. No wonder their feet were freezing. Dmitri conducted a test. He let the fire die at 8 p.m., 10 p.m., 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Midnight, 58 degrees Fahrenheit. 6 a.m., 52 degrees Fahrenheit. 10 hours without fire, and the cabin dropped only 9 degrees. He tested Boris's cabin while Boris was out. Without fire, it lost 20 degrees in 6 hours. When Alexei saw the numbers, he sat silent. "I've been doing it wrong," he said. 3 winters I've been freezing. And the answer was right there in the dirt. The Petrov family stayed for 16 days. Alexei asked Dmitri to teach him. Dmitri spent an afternoon drawing diagrams. Boris Ivanov held out longer. Pride kept him silent. But on February 2nd, with his woodpile gone, his wife ill, he appeared at Dmitri's door, hat in hand. "I need to understand," Boris said, looking at the floor. "I called you ignorant. I told people you live like an animal. You didn't know," Dmitri said. "I didn't want to know," Boris corrected. "I was so certain that civilized ways were better." Will you teach me? Come spring, Dmitri shook his hand. Bring your wagon. The river has enough clay for everyone. By March, Dmitri had commitments from 7 families. The spring thaw brought a frenzy of activity. Wagons hauling clay, reindeer being slaughtered for blood. Dmitri supervised, refusing payment. My grandmother never charged for teaching, he said. B.Y. Summer. 11 cabins in the settlement had clay floors. The technique spread. Dimitri's notebook of measurements circulated until the pages were soft. The numbers spoke louder than arguments. The dirt floor wasn't poverty. It was wisdom. Dmitri Volkov lived another 40 years on that Siberian homestead. He died in the 1930s, surrounded by grandchildren who had grown up walking barefoot on the floor he built. The original clay surface lasted until the 1950s, when his grandson finally covered it with linoleum, not because it failed, but because his new wife thought it looked old-fashioned. Beneath the linoleum, the clay remained intact, smooth and solid after 60 years. The winter of 1894 killed 43 people across the Yakutsk region. The Volkovs burned less than 3 cords of wood, while their neighbors burned 10. The difference was 6 inches of clay and reindeer blood. Modern science calls it thermal mass flooring. The principles Dmitri understood intuitively are now in engineering textbooks. The earth holds heat. The materials beneath our feet, dismissed as dirt by those who consider themselves civilized, can be transformed into heating systems that require no fuel. Dmitri never boasted. He simply taught anyone willing to learn. Some knowledge survives in universities. Other knowledge survives because someone stubborn enough to trust it refuses to let it die. Because of him, families stayed warm. The clay doesn't care about pride. It just holds a heat, steady and patient, the way it has for generations.